If you're listening to the deep dive, it's probably because you want to understand the world like a little better, maybe even a little faster, right? We get it. And today we're going deep into the ideas of this philosopher. Get this. He was such a big deal back in the day that when he gave a lecture in New York, it actually caused a traffic jam on Broadway in 1913.
Can you imagine?
Wow.
We're talking about Henri Bergson, a French thinker, lived from 1859 to 1941. And no, he wasn't just some academic hiding in a dusty library.
Right.
This guy was a genuine celebrity, a philosophical rock star. In fact, he's been called the first international superstar of philosophy. And get this, his books, philosophical books, mind you, were bestsellers.
Wow. It makes you wonder what the intellectual scene was like back then.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
So for this deep dive, we're looking at excerpts from this piece titled Henri Bergson pense como homem de ação, haja como homem de pensamento.
Right, which basically means think like a man of action, act like a man of thought.
Right off the bat, you can tell we're not just dealing with abstract theories here, but ideas that, actually have real-world implications.
Absolutely.
So our goal today, our mission, is to really break down Bergson's work, especially his ideas about time, consciousness, and, well, the very nature of reality.
Big stuff.
Big stuff. But we want to make it clear and applicable for you. No need for overly complicated philosophical jargon.
Exactly. We'll keep it grounded.
So what was it about Bergson that just captivated so many people? What made him such a sensation?
Okay, so think about this. His book, Creative Evolution, which gets pretty deep, went through 21 editions. By 1918.
That's a lot of editions.
It is. And for a book that expects you to understand Darwin's theory of evolution and then follow all these complex metaphysical arguments,
Yeah,
it says a lot about the intellectual appetite of the time.
definitely. People were clearly hungry for knowledge, grappling with some big questions. And Bergson wasn't just, stuck in the ivory tower. He was a professor, holding 2 prestigious chairs at the Collège de France.
Yeah. Yes, very influential.
Won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1927, which just goes to show how beautifully he expressed his ideas and how broadly they resonated. And here's a fun fact.
Okay, let's hear it.
He actually played a significant role as a diplomat, even helping convince the U.S. to enter World War I. He was quoted as saying, "France was saved. It was the greatest joy of my life."
Really?
He was also involved in setting up the Intellectual Cooperation Committee of the League of Nations, which, eventually became UNESCO. So he was very much engaged with the world, with the major events of his time.
That's right. A philosopher who is very much in the world. But it's worth noting that his legacy hasn't been without, some reevaluation.
Oh. How so?
Bertrand Russell, the philosopher. He later offered a pretty critical take on Bergson's impact, especially regarding the Vichy government in World War II. Kind of a sobering reminder that even the most celebrated figures can be seen through different lenses as time goes on.
That's true. Adds a layer of complexity to his story. Speaking of his story, his background is pretty interesting too. Bergson was actually born to an English mother and a French father, so he was bilingual from the very beginning.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he ended up choosing to be a French citizen, which, given later events, becomes even more significant.
It does. And then there's his relationship with religion, which is also quite nuanced. He came from a Jewish background, but, there was a period where he actually questioned his faith because of evolutionary theory.
Really?
Yeah. Later on, he was drawn to Roman Catholicism, saw it as complementing his Jewish heritage.
Fascinating.
And it's quite a paradox that even though some of his writings were on the Catholic Church's list of prohibited books, a Catholic priest still officiated at his funeral.
That's really striking, that final act of respect despite their differences.
It is. And it really sets the stage for his incredible courage during the Nazi occupation in 1940. Here's this 81-year-old man, a giant in the world of ideas, and he refuses to take an exemption that would have, protected him from having to register as a Jew.
Wow.
And he didn't just refuse it quietly. He gave up his positions, his honors, everything. And then, in an act of incredible solidarity, he stood in line with other Jewish people on a freezing cold day to register.
You're kidding.
Knowing full well the dangers involved. Tragically, he passed away just 2 weeks later from bronchitis in 1941, just barely escaping the fate that awaited so many others. This act of defiance, of commitment to his community, really makes you think about some of those later criticisms, like Russell's, and wonder if they missed a crucial aspect of who he was.
It really does. This wasn't just abstract philosophy for Bergson, it was something he truly lived by. So let's talk about some of those core philosophical ideas, those big ideas. Our source mentions that Bergson, like Brentano and Husserl, began his academic journey immersed in Greek and Latin, mathematics, that kind of thing.
That's right.
He saw philosophy as a rigorous discipline, almost like a science, but one that went beyond simply observing the physical world.
It's a crucial point. He wasn't just, coming up with these ideas out of thin air. He had a very strong background in logical, analytical thinking. In fact, his first published work was actually a solution to a mathematical problem posed by Pascal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And his teacher supposedly said that mathematics' loss was philosophy's gain.
I can see why.
And even his later development of the concept of multiplicity, which we'll get into, was directly influenced by his engagement with the work of the mathematician Riemann. So he was really using the tools of science to probe these deeper questions about existence.
That's really interesting. So he had this solid scientific grounding, and then he used that to tackle these, well, almost metaphysical questions.
Exactly.
And out of this came his three big ideas: duration, intuition, and what he called élan vital.
Right. Big stuff.
So let's start with duration, or what some people call lived time. What's the key idea here?
Okay, so with duration, the main point is that there's a big difference between how we experience time and how science, typically measures it. Bergson argued that time, as we live it, is this continuous flow of subjective states. Think about it. An hour spent doing something you love just flies by, but an hour waiting for something can feel like an eternity.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Clock time might say they're both 60 minutes.
Yeah.
But our internal experience, our duration, is totally different.
Exactly. One moment feels like it's gone in a flash, the other drags on forever.
It's elastic, it's personal, it's not fixed.
So duration captures that subjective, almost fluid quality of time as we experience it.
Exactly.
Okay, what about intuition? What did Bergson mean by that?
So he wasn't talking about some kind of, mystical hunch or a gut feeling. He was very specific. He defined it as, and I'm quoting here, instinct that has become disinterested, self-conscious, capable of reflecting upon its object, enlarging it indefinitely.
Okay, break that down for me.
So it's like a highly refined instinct, one that can understand things on a much deeper level than just intellect alone. It's not just a feeling, it's a way of knowing.
So it's about tapping into a deeper level of understanding that goes beyond logic or analysis.
Exactly.
Okay, and lastly, there's élan vital, often translated as vital impulse. What's that all about?
So élan vital is basically Bergson's attempt to explain what drives evolution, what pushes it forward. He felt that purely mechanistic scientific explanations, those that reduce everything to just physical processes, couldn't fully account for the creativity and the newness that we see in life.
It's like something is missing from the purely scientific picture.
Right. So he proposed this idea of an inherent creative energy, an impulse within living things that drives them to evolve, to become something new.
It makes sense. Like there's this internal push, a creative force that's at work.
Yes, exactly.
It's fascinating that some scholars today are actually revisiting his ideas, especially those about, the embodied subject, how we experience our bodies and how that ties into our sense of self and time, and his concept of multiplicity, which we definitely need to unpack. But first, let's go back to this problem of time a bit more. Our source mentions that while Heidegger is often considered, the big 20th century philosopher of time, Bergson's work on time is just as important, though they come at it from different angles.
Right. It's interesting to compare their approaches. Heidegger, with his focus on being towards death and his analysis of technology, took a more existential route. Bergson, on the other hand, with his scientific background and his metaphysical talent, approached the question of time in a very different way. He was looking at the nature of time from a perspective that was very much rooted in his understanding of the natural world.
And he was pretty critical of the way science and math represented time. He argued that they presented this static, almost frozen picture that didn't capture the dynamic flow of our actual lived experience, much like William James's idea of the stream of consciousness.
Exactly. He uses this great analogy in The Creative Mind. He says that the moment we try to measure a piece of time, to isolate it, that very act kind of freezes it, makes it disappear, like trying to catch a river in a net, Yeah. You might trap some water, but the flow, the essence of the river, it just escapes.
Right, because time, as we experience it, is all about movement. It's constantly flowing, and even our perception of how fast or slow it's going can change so much.
Exactly. For Bergson, time isn't this objective thing out there that we can just, precisely measure. It's fundamentally tied to our individual experience, and it can only be grasped through intuition, that self-conscious instinct we were talking about earlier.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, this idea of duration, this flowing experience of time, it leads us to his concept of multiplicity, right?
Mhm.
Now, our source mentions Gilles Deleuze, another philosopher who in his book Bergsonism describes multiplicity as something that can't just be counted or, broken down into separate pieces.
Right.
Bergson himself made this distinction between quantitative and qualitative multiplicity. What's the difference between those two?
Okay, so if we think back to our conversation about time, quantitative multiplicity is about things that are separate, distinct,
Yeah.
even if they're similar. Like, take Bergson's example of a flock of sheep. You can count them: one sheep, two sheep, three sheep, and so on. They're individual units, even if they all look alike.
So it's about things that are separate and can be counted, even if they share some similarities, like grains of sand on a beach.
Exactly. Now, qualitative multiplicity, that's totally different. It's about how our experiences, our emotions, our thoughts, they all kind of blend and flow together over time. It's not about counting separate things. It's about understanding the way our inner lives are constantly changing.
I see. So it's not about adding up separate units, but about grasping this continuous fluid process of change.
Right. And his example of the emotion of solidarity is really interesting here.
Yeah, he talks about how solidarity isn't just a single feeling, but something that develops over time through a kind of progression of other emotions.
Yeah. He talks about this idea of qualitative progress. So imagine you see someone who's suffering. Your first reaction might be one of aversion, maybe even disgust. But then you might realize that you too could be in that position, and that leads to a feeling of fear. But this fear can then transform into a sense of shared vulnerability, a recognition of your connection with the other person, and that's where solidarity emerges. And that feeling of solidarity can even deepen into something like humility. It's not that you're just adding up different feelings, it's that one feeling is actually transforming into another, creating something new.
So it's not just a stronger version of the initial feeling, it's a fundamental shift in the nature of the emotion itself.
That's right. And it really highlights the complexity of our emotional lives, right?
It does. And it emphasizes Bergson's point that reality, especially the reality of consciousness, isn't made up of these fixed, isolated elements. It's a dynamic, flowing process.
Exactly.
Now, this brings us to Bergson's view on the role of philosophy in everyday life. It's interesting that someone who dealt with such, abstract ideas also saw the everyday world as this rich source of philosophical inquiry.
He did.
And this is really evident in his book, Laughter, an essay on the meaning of the comic.
Fascinating book.
Why do you think he focused on something like laughter?
Well, for Bergson, laughter offered this unique window into the human imagination, particularly our social and collective imagination. He was asking, fundamental questions like what makes us laugh? What's the essence of the comic? He believed that by understanding laughter, we could learn a lot about how we function as social beings.
So it wasn't just a trivial pursuit for him. He saw it as a way to reveal deeper truths about human interaction.
Exactly. And it speaks to a broader point about Bergson's whole approach to philosophy. Even though some of his ideas are, pretty abstract, he was always concerned with how we experience and understand the world around us. He was interested in the questions we ask, how those questions lead to the development of scientific theories. He wasn't just lost in thought. He was grounded in the reality of human experience.
Our source describes him as this tireless, behind-the-scenes worker in philosophy, a true representative of, the best of the French intellectual tradition.
And they even suggest that his relevance is increasing as some of those, later 20th century philosophical trends maybe fade a bit.
That's interesting.
It is. If you think about it, our world today, with all its rapid changes and constant flow of information, it almost feels like Bergson's ideas about, the importance of lived experience, the dynamic nature of reality, they resonate even more now. There's this great quote from Creative Evolution. He says, "I pass from state to state. I am warm or cold. I am merry or sad. I work or I do nothing. I look at what is around me or I think of something else. Sensations, feelings, volitions, ideas, such are the changes into which my existence is divided and which color it in turn. I change then without ceasing."
And he goes on to argue that this interchange is actually much more profound than we realize, that even our mental states, which we think of as stable, are in constant flux.
And that their duration, their very existence, depends on this flow.
It's a powerful reminder that we are dynamic beings, always changing, always becoming. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Henri Bergson, this philosophical superstar, we've covered a lot of ground. duration, that subjective flowing experience of time, intuition as this powerful tool for deeper understanding, élan vital, the creative force driving evolution, and then the distinction between quantitative and qualitative multiplicity.
Big ideas.
Big ideas. And taken together, they really offer unique perspective on time, on consciousness, on how we experience the world.
They challenge us to move beyond these rigid, static ways of thinking and to embrace the fluidity, the dynamism of reality.
Exactly. And that brings us to our final thought for you to ponder. Think about Bergson's ideas and consider how might this distinction between lived time and clock time affect how you perceive your own day, how you value different experiences. Could a deeper understanding of the qualitative nature of your experiences, how they evolve and change within you, could that lead to a richer understanding of yourself and the people around you? It's a question we're sitting with long after this deep dive is over.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.